Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
The public was shocked in 1978 when members of Jim Jones People's Temple all died in a combination mass murder-suicide. 11 years later, America has forgotten about this tragedy, but the recent murders in Matamoros bring cults to our attention once again. Hello, I'm Sarita Tamayo, member of St. Austin's Catholic Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Today we will get to discuss a misunderstood and sometimes frightening part of our culture, namely cults. We will be speaking with members of the community who have come into contact with cults either through counseling or research or both. Our guests include Gene Edwards, a student at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary and a direct care person at Charter Lane Hospital, Dr. Bill Nethercutt, a classics professor at the University of Texas, who has done research on topics ranging from ancient mystery religions to the New Age movement, and Dr. Byron Stone, a child psychiatrist. We welcome you all. Now let's begin by finding out something about each of you. Now Byron, I know you're a child psychiatrist. What is involved in your practice of psychiatry?
Well, I work with children, adults, and adolescents, and I see people with problems. They're unhappy or upset or can't get along, not doing well in school, and I see them in the office sometimes, and sometimes have to see them in the hospital where I work.
Oh my. Well, let's go to Gene now. You're a student at the Presbyterian Theological Seminary?
Right.
So you are studying to become a minister?
Yes, ma'am. I'm a senior at the seminary at this time and hope to graduate in December.
And how is that related to your involvement at the Charter Lane Hospital?
Well, I've been in direct care work since 1982, really. Right after I finished my training in clinical pastoral education at Austin State Hospital, I worked out there from 82 to 87 and started working at Charter Lane part-time while I was going to school. And that's how I've been involved with them since, well, almost 2 years next month now.
Wonderful. Okay. Now, Bill, you're a classics professor at UT. Could you describe your life as a professor to us?
Well, it's a great life. In classics, what we do is a variety of interdisciplinary things. We do Greek, Latin, ancient civilization, archaeology, philosophy, religion, numismatics, and there are many, many other things. Astrology and some occult subjects were the focus of a course I gave this past spring, which had a great number of students in it, and they were very enthusiastic, and it was a vital sort of course, and of course, of all times, then to have the situation at Matamoros develop.
Well, you did go down to Matamoros, didn't you?
That's right, yes.
What did you observe there?
Well, I saw some very gruesome things, which I believe that many people have seen on the television and the news reports. And the major reason, I think, that they were interested in contacting some academic people was that there was some ambiguity as to whether this was a certain cult of voodoo, whether there was something called Santeria, whether, on the other hand, it was plain old witchcraft from the Renaissance days, or just exactly what it was. And so they sought input from anthropologists, and as I say in my field, classics. We have so many different things that converge. They figured that it perhaps could give an additional perspective.
Well, maybe we should begin the discussion by defining cults, and perhaps you could help us with the etymology of the word and maybe give us a reference point.
I think that we could, excuse me, speak of the etymology of the word, and my colleagues here can tell what the reality, which is another side to the whole thing, would be, as people commonly understand it. It comes from a Latin word which means two things that may surprise you. One is to cherish, and that talks about the commitment of emotion, of affection for whatever the revered practices and the revered vision are or is. The second thing is to do your exercises. It has to do with tilling the field. We get our word cultivation from it. So we think of a good cult member as somebody who says catechisms on a regular basis or observes proper witchcraft ritual, or somebody who in all of this maintains quite a glowing vision within his or her own personal heart. as to what really is being accomplished at this point.
Well, thank you. Now let's see, well, Byron, what would be the mental health aspects of cults? Like, why would people enter one? What happens to them when they're in one?
Well, I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that the psychiatric scientific literature on cults indicates surprisingly that that people who join cults are not necessarily more disturbed mentally and emotionally than people in the general population. Now, the caveat is that satanic and evil cults are not well researched, because the people are engaged in activities that make their cooperation with research efforts minimal. But when people join a cult, it appears to be generally they appear to be at a susceptible point in their lives, and that's why sometimes, as we were talking earlier before the show, that often people in their late teens and early 20s get kind of hooked up into cults, because they're at a point in their life when they feel they lack direction, and they feel like they need some guidance, and they're looking for answers, and the world is full of ambiguous situations, and they feel a very strong need for a sense of belonging and believing. And oftentimes the people, the cults and the cult's leaders, who are generally very charismatic people, provide what seem like easy answers to people who lack a sense of direction at that time. And when people get hooked up into a cult, they then are influenced by a number of
Different factors.
different mind control sort of efforts, which may then make it very hard for them to separate from the cult once they've gotten involved.
Well, Gene, haven't you counseled some of the youth that have actually been in cults?
Yes, I've been involved with some children, adolescents, who've gotten into cults or either been sort of dabbling in cults. And we had a situation where I work now, where there was one family that had 5 children who were members of the family who were actually involved in ritualistic abuse through a satanic cult down in San Marcos is where it was, and came into the hospital and had a chance to spend some time with them, and it was kind of a scary thing to see the trauma that they had experienced and the way they were trying to deal with that trauma. And so that's I think a thing that is happening around us. As I think I pointed out earlier in our conversation, around Austin, there are a couple of places that are really active with satanic cults. I think Taylor and San Marcos, and I'm not trying to pinpoint cities or call names, but I know that a lot of the experience that I've had my own personal self, and have talked with people who are involved in this kind of thing. Those are 2 of the real areas where there's a lot of that activity going on. It's going on nationwide and worldwide. It's not just a local phenomenon that we're experiencing. It's experienced everywhere, in California and Florida and all over the whole United States, even up in the East, the Middle East and the Northeast parts of our country. So I think it's a growing thing. It may be that the people that are involved in it feel more freedom now to come out in the open with it and that kind of thing. But I think it's something that we certainly need to be aware of.
And what about some of the symbols associated with the cults, especially now, all the furor over the peace symbol, the cross of Nero? Could you elaborate on that a bit?
I can elaborate on that some. Yeah, in fact, there was an article in the Austin Statesman, I think it was either this week or last week, that I was going to try to keep, and it got thrown away, that actually had a whole article about the controversy now that's going on with the peace symbol from the 60s as we understood it. And you can see it here on the screen. Actually was the cross of Nero, and where that sort of ties in, and as we've talked before we came in tonight, that actually is the cross that supposedly Peter in the Bible, in our scriptures, was crucified on upside down in order not to be crucified the same as as Christ was. And Nero to add further humiliation to this whole thing, broke the arms of the cross down to show the conquest of Rome, or of the emperor over the Christian God. And so that's sort of where it stems from historically, and it was used as a peace symbol in the 60s, and now it's becoming more and more associated with the satanic cults. It's more of an evil symbol now than a peace symbol for our society in the 80s.
Well, Bill, could you give us a historical perspective on perhaps this symbol, or just the way cults fit into the pattern of our society, where they began and how they have evolved?
It goes over many, many years. It comes to pass, I believe, rises from man's basic sense of being apart and seeking to build a bridge somehow to get over that intervening distance and isolation. So to identify oneself with a greater power is something which even people who pride themselves in being quite practical and not necessarily spiritual or philosophic, nonetheless they find that it impinges upon their own consciousness considerably. All these early mystery religions, there's so many of them, I don't think we really have time at the moment, though we could come back to some perhaps if you desire, are really different ways of handling that basic problem. What seemed to emerge in Rome was something which came really from other places, really farther to the east in Turkey and over in Iran and Persia, where people would mutilate themselves, seeking to identify themselves as completely as possible with the greater power, with the greater one. Some priests would cut their arms, let the blood flow down, they would castrate themselves, offer their very selfhood, you might say, to this greater sense of power and of God. The Christian apologists in 300 AD were outraged to see traditional and high-ranking Roman priests in beautiful vestments standing underneath a slaughtered bull whose blood was trickling down between cracks in the planks. And these fellows would raise their eyes and mouths to the blood. And one man in particular, a Christian apologist, Tertullian, thought that this was an abomination unto the Lord if ever there was one. We get at this time also the stated recruitment, especially of younger people in their teens, to be parts of such cults, especially the worship of Dionysus at an earlier point. As you come into the Renaissance, the sense of witches becomes very, very important, and of course we have the Inquisition. It's women more often than men, clearly, that are tied up in this sort of thing. And there was one very enlightened man named John Weir, or W-E-Y-E-R, who wrote a long treatise on the deceptive tricks, as he called it, played by demons. His argument was that if you look at the kind of people that become witches, basically they're people who have diets that ought to contain more cholesterol. They're people that eat too many salads and have too much bitter food in their lives and black bile. And we ought to have a sense of humanity and compassion for them. He tried to observe witches who claimed they flew away to witches' Sabbaths after anointing the veins in their wrists and arms with belladonna and other things, and said that where they claimed they were away, they were really in a coma almost, just sitting right there the whole time. He tried to treat the thing scientifically, and his writing stands out as a particular light from that period around 1560. We have then the recruitment of the young, the sense of people who were searching for some centrality in their lives. And when we come then to our own century, and certainly this is a wild hop, skip, and jumping, what we find now is still the young, whose ability to believe, whose special psychological energy would be a thing much to be prized in any concentrated effort. Yes, any organization. It's very important to make the point that Dr. Stone made. That is, these people don't seem to be any more deranged than the rest of us. It simply shows that we are spiritual beings, that what this is, even the most outrageous things, apparently is one manifestation or another, sometimes bizarre, of our desire to seek and to become part of something more than ourselves, which means that spiritual education, that spiritual analysis, and the teaching of values are so important to try and allow your growing child or your students to gain some perspective for discriminating among the competing sects and cults.
Well, it sounds as though we need to address that. Would you like to?
Well, I think that the spiritual education is a very important thing, but One factor that I'd like to point out is that I believe that one of the social problems, if you will, that we have that promotes kind of an inclination toward evil or satanic groups is that there is not an adequate encouragement of the awareness of the potential for evil or a wrongdoing that is present within each of us. And as a consequence, you know, we're told, be good, be good, be good. And we are not reminded that each of us has the capacity to do wrong and to be evil. And as a consequence, the evil is projected outward elsewhere, and it gets focused in areas like these groups, and people tend to be attracted to it. I'm not saying that I would encourage people to engage in this sort of thing, but what we have is a setup, a kind of a social split, and you've got everybody saying evil is something that's always over there, and as a consequence, yeah, it winds up being over there in groups like that. And so I think that we need to encourage an awareness of the wholeness of humanity and the fact that our spirituality encompasses a great deal of power to do good, but also power to do evil, and we need to remember that and face it in order to keep it in check. The psychiatrist Carl Jung, I think, would have referred to this as the collective shadow, and we have to face the shadow in order to have power over it.
I think that's a pretty good point you're making too, Dr. Stone, because I think also that evil can be expressed in a setting where it's not considered bad, in a cult like this, where a lot of times the whole thing of pattern that we understand has been reversed, where good is evil and evil is good. And I think that's a good point that you brought out, and I think you both have valid points. I think the education in the spiritual areas is a good thing, because I think a lot of people right now are searching for something, some other meaning. It's like the old Peggy Lee song, "Is that all there is to love?" and all these kind of searching songs about life and trying to find meaning. And I think that what happens, a lot of young people today especially, I think we're seeing a lot of that searching for meaning and why am I here and where am I going, and a lot of these people try to give easy answers to these young people by saying, well, come with us and we'll give you the answers and let you have the answer to all these problems and give you a way to really be a part of something.
Yeah, I think all of us who, you see it at Charter Lane Hospital. I work at a different hospital. I work at Shoal Creek Hospital here in Austin, and I think that all of us who work with children and adolescents who are, struggling and having problems, we see that they want some solutions. Families want answers too, and the fact of the matter is that there aren't any easy answers most of the time, and this is what attracts people, I think, to cults, whether they're satanic cults or other cults like the Moonies and other religious cults. Is people are looking for easy answers, and they get into a cult and they find that there's a direction for them. They are told specifically what to do and how to do it, and if they deviate from that, there's a tremendous group pressure to conform, right? And it's very difficult. It's very hard for us, just kind of struggling with our day-to-day existence, to think of how tough it would be if we had all of our answers given to us and then were removed from that situation and had no direction and no answers and no certainty anymore. And that's the problem that people face when they leave a cult.
I think you're right.
I'm sure that you see that in the work that you've done.
Oh yeah, I see that quite often. I think that's a real good point. And I think that again, the sense of leaving and the intimidation, the threats that actually have been carried out in some cults. I'm thinking of that one incident in Houston where that one family, that man and his, I think it was his family, were actually killed by a quote-unquote cult group there in Houston. He was told if he left, this was going to happen. And I don't know if they've actually tied that into that cult that's being involved in that, but there was a threat against his life. And that happens a lot with people who try to leave I think especially the satanic cults and I don't, some of the other ones, maybe the Santerias and some of those cults, where they actually are threatened if you leave, you're not going to live. Just to not belabor this, but to share, a friend of mine is is working as a chaplain out at Gardner House, and she was telling me about a 16-year-old that had come in there and was actually living in fear of that person's life, because that person had been told, if you leave the cult, you're dead. And this person really believed that they were going to get him. And so, you know, that was a real scary thing for her to talk. She talked with this person for quite a while, and this person was really scared and really believed that this was going to happen. So I think there's a lot of that goes on.
Well, maybe we could take a look at those slides now that you had lent us.
Yeah, and I'll try to explain those as best I can.
The altars for the satanic cult.
Yeah, these are actually, and certainly feel free to jump in here, Dr. Northcutt, and say what you want. This is actually a couple of, this slide and the next one that we'll be seeing in a second are from actually a Santeria group. You're normally, if you're going to look at say a black mass kind of an altar, you'll see a little bit different setup. Normally the skull will certainly be there. The candle will certainly be there. And in this particular slide, we see a skull with candles around that, and there's probably some spikes or nails, and all these things are symbolic as far as the cult is concerned in the way that they interact. This is another one that has a skull, as you can see, with the candle actually melted on top. It's usually a black candle, and again, that skull is symbolic of the power that the cult's trying to get. And they actually get these. There's places where you can actually buy these things. You can buy human skulls. If there's places that sell them, or if not, they go out and do grave robbings. There's a lot of grave robbings. They use the bones and the skulls in their ceremonies. And like I said, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add with this. But you'll see a lot of this used with the candles and the skulls. A lot of that's used, even in the satanic ritual, where you'll have usually the black altar cloth with the inverted pentagram on it. You'll see the knives and the kind of ritualistic tools they use in their own rituals. Each group sort of has their own thing.
Well, the basic feeling that skulls are hallucinogenic, that is, that they really have the power to cause you deep within your mind to hear voices or to feel that you were in contact with something which is very powerful, goes all the way back. There's a wonderful book called The Origin of Conscious and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which is quite a title, by Jaynes, J-A-Y-N-E-S, in which he documents the appearance of skulls at such sites in the Mesolithic period as Ainon, Jericho, and apparently what was done was that people would come and stand in front of the skull of the ancestor and look. And usually in very early Assyrian iconography, it shows the king who has departed with his mouth open, and the person is there listening, ready to receive the word. And one of the important things which people in this whole history have thought led to a new consciousness of spirits of the air was the feeling that one could not communicate directly with the other powers of the skulls like they used to. And so you find at a later time, say around 1100 or so BC or slightly before that, the king who goes where before the departed king, the other king had sat, there's just an empty throne now. And there isn't any mouth open. It's just standing there hoping to hear something from the other side. So the skull has that very ancient history. And when you saw the slide just now, the second one that we looked at, it might have reminded you of the Temple of Doom, you know, that famous film. But you can really gain a feeling for how people would be, well, you might almost say taken over, or deeply impressed and moved, let's say, by that impact.
Well, we're nearing the end of the show. I would like to ask for concluding remarks. Byron, is there a particular point you'd like to make?
Well, the point that I'd like to make is to remind the audience that the scientific literature gives kind of mixed reviews with regard to the mental health of people in cults. It appears that the people who join or kind of have a sense of a need for belonging and belief, and they often find it in cults. We need to avoid making the same mistakes that cult members make in thinking that necessarily all cults are bad and that all cults do evil. It's hard for me to imagine approving of a satanic cult, but I'm just saying that we need to look at each case individually and make sure
be
that
objective.
try to be objective about it. It's hard to be objective about something like this. But people, when they do leave cults, they often do need counseling and assistance, not necessarily deprogramming, but some assistance with the separation and loss that they experience after leaving a cult.
And Gene, do you have anything?
Well, I think of course, as a potential minister and as a parent, I guess one of the main goals that I have is to help my children understand these things, and of course they're going to have to develop their own value systems, and I think that's important. But I think it's also important as a parent and as a minister, and I think parents may be kind of important in that whole aspect of my children and other children, is not to try to scare them or to be judgmental, but to let them know that there are certain things out there that are not good for them, like there's certain music that I tell my children that I don't think it's really healthy for them to listen to, or certain literature. And certainly they're probably going to go out and try to experience some of these things, and I think that can be a healthy, in a way, if it's guided. So I think that my main stress would be on what Dr. Stone said, and also what Dr. Northcutt said, the education of it, the aspect that we all have a potential to do evil, and that people who join cults are no different looking than we are.
Well, thank you very much for these comments. We have to come to an end now, and I have some addresses very quickly. If you want more information, you can write to the International Cult Education Program, P.O. Box 1232, Gracie Station, New York, New York, 128. After having had this view of cults in our society, we must now bring the program to a close. And I'd like to thank you, Byron, Gene, and Bill, for all of the information you've given us. In behalf of the Austin Metropolitan Ministries, I'm Sarita Tamayo,